Hey guys, how you doing? It's another episode of Past Meets Profit here. Today we're gonna be talking about uh kind of reverse what we were talking about before, where it was the success of a small nation. Now we're going to be talking about fall of a large nation. That nation's going to be the Qing dynasty. So why do they fall? First, let's look at it from a political standpoint. One, the Qing bureaucracy by the 19th century, the 1800s, became overextended, corrupt, and slow to respond. Local officials often acted independent from the crown, and the court struggled to enforce any sort of reform or bring in taxation, which weakened their ability to adapt and eroded imperial legitimacy. Two was internal rebellions and civil wars. Now, um, rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion, the Nian Rebellion, and then Muslim uprisings in the west of the nation all served to destroy or help play a part in destroying the Qing. Why? Well, the Taiping Rebellion alone killed between 20 and 30 million people. Insane amount. Um, and it forced the Qing to rely on regional armies instead of uh, a central one, which, again, only served to weaken their central control and give more power to uh, local officials. Third reason came in form of foreign invaders and the unequal treaties. Now, these Western powers and the Western powers in Japan seeing the weakness of the seeing the weakness of the Qing dynasty, capitalized on it and attacked. Saw this in the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War. This resulted in the forced opening of ports, loss of territory, loss of tariff autonomy, and spheres of influence. Uh, so what this really did was basically after this point, the Qing only really became were only sovereign. It was only really a sovereign nation by name. In reality, the these Western powers and the Japanese have taken so much control over the nation that they were more in control than the Qings themselves were. They lost their autonomy over themselves. Four was court factionalism and reform paralysis. The corruption of the state, the weak central control meant that they could not reform, they could not grow, they could not adapt to the world around. Why? The corrupt individuals didn't want to end the corruption, and there was a fear that the reforms would undermine the imperial rule itself. Which what this did was it left China institutionally outdated compared to rising global powers. What's kind of ironic about this former point was that the collapse of the dynastic legitimacy came from the fact they were unwilling to adapt. Why? Because the Confucian political ideology demanded order, which they lost through their weak central control. Again, governance, they lost because they weren't able to adapt in order to properly govern their nation, and moral leadership, which by not adapting for the good of the nation, they did not hold. With the Qing failing to provide these three, the people turned towards other other ideologies such as republicanism, nationalism, and from all this came a large anti-Manchu sentiment because the Qing dynasty were the have roots in Manchuria. Um, so by the early 20th century, by the end of the Victorian era, the dynasty had lost pretty much all their moral, political, um, and sovereign authority. Now, also now that we saw the economic reasons, the political reasons, let's look into the economic. First, the population growth outpaced uh, the food, the resources available in the Qing dynasty. From 1650 to 1850, China's population tripled. However, farmland did not expand proportionally. Agricultural productivity did not expand proportionally. All this led to rural poverty deepening and the uh, just the funnel, I guess you look at it, that this society become made a much more volatile for rebellions, famine, death. Why? Well, the number one reason people rebel is because they don't have food on their plate. The number one reason that if you can't survive without food on your plate. So this led to a lot of revolts, rebellions, unrest, and uh, destability within the Qing. Secondly, was a financial crisis, or the fiscal crisis, rather. Qing's tax system was built for the 1600s, not for a Victorian era. Again, they were at this point they were completely and utterly were not able to collect taxes as they had no central control. Um, the tax system was not updated as the population surged and gets eaten away by corruption by these local officials. As a result, even though the price of governance went up, the revenue stagnated or even fell potentially. Military modernization became nearly impossible because they didn't have the revenue to fund it, and local officials lacked funds to manage disasters. Despite the fact that they were taking a slice by themselves because they were corrupt, they were taking it for themselves, not for um not for the provinces. So when disaster did strike, the local area, and the government and the central government of the Qing dynasty did not have the funds to manage any disasters that came their way, such as food shortages or disease, famine, etc. Three goes back to the foreign economic penetration. After military defeats, China lost control over tariffs, key ports such as Hong Kong, etc., in certain industries such as mining and railways. Basically, tariffs, which at the time were one of, not the largest form of revenue for any country, was lost. We lost key ports to trade out of, which would bring a lot of revenue via taxation from trade and tariffs. We lost certain industries of mining and railways, meant that the Qing really could not capitalize on their own resources. Now, another effect of these wars is that a lot of money had to be paid to these foreign powers. So outflows and indemnity payments drained the Qing treasury, and China ended up becoming pretty much economically dependent on foreign powers, which led to them being diplomatically independent as well, or dependent as well. For again, as we see from the lack of the ability to reform in many cases due to corruption, they also failed to industrialize. They did not centralize capital. On the other hand, it was more decentralized. They did not mobilize any modernization, and it struggled to build national infrastructure. What this meant is that they were in the 1800s, again, living on a 1600s economy and could not adapt to the times, which left them pretty much backward and unable to produce what was necessary to defend themselves. And last but not least was the decline of traditional economic institutions. The agrarian economy suffered from land fragmentation, tenant farming increases, rural debt, and exploitative landlords. So not only were they unable to adapt a more modern economy, they were also unable to fully utilize their agrarian economy, which weakens the social stability and prevented the state from raising a reliable revenue, which then they can use to industrialize. And we were talking about Brandenburg in the past. They're in a similar situation, but instead of both having agrarian economies, where they differed is that Prussia was able to use their agrarian economy to eventually start to fuel their industrial, whereas the Qing, they didn't have really anything because they couldn't perform in any way, shape, or form. So what can we learn from their failures? One, be be willing to adapt and be willing to take control. The Qing had no ability to take control over their own affairs, domestic or foreign. What this meant, they couldn't industrialize, they couldn't adapt, whether it be their political institutions, their social and their economic institutions. What this meant is that when the time came, they had no ability to stop others from stopping all over them. Um, Second thing I'll say is that this especially speaks towards anyone in a management role or above where you have responsibility over others. The culture is more important than the system itself. If the Qing was able to stop the corruption, they would have been able to reform. But the the corruption and really the culture of corruption within the Qing fully made it fully impossible for them to reform and to grow as a nation, and economically or politically. Now, or for the dynasty rather. Take that in the modern world. If you were in a culture that is toxic, where people can't learn, where in somewhere for um is in a poor state, you're not going to be able to change it. You're not going to be able to capitalize off it. Um, so last but certainly not least is last but certainly not least. This is sorry guys. Certainly not last but certainly not least is to learn from others. If China was able to adapt the same way that Japan was and see how they did it and to adapt themselves, they would have been able to avoid this altogether and be able to industrialize, which would have prevented them being steamrolled as a nation and fallen into the state of disrepair. Now, thank you very much, guys. I'll see you again for the next one.